Advanced Project Invoicing. This course builds upon the basic courses of project contracts and project invoicing. By the end of this course, you should know how to set up advanced funding for project contracts, how to process adjustments on posted transactions and credit notes, how to set up retentions with your customers and how to request the release of those retentions, and then how to bulk create invoices in an unattended way and how to post the bulk created invoices as a batch process. The first section is about funding setup. Here we'll learn about customer funding, internal or grant funding, and on-hold funding. A funding source is a party that is responsible for payment of a contract. A project contract in AX must have at least one funding source. In some cases, you may have an engagement with a large customer that may want to share the cost of the engagement among 2 or 3 departments. Or in some cases, you may have 2 or 3 customers paying for this particular contractual engagement. Let's create a project contract that has such a type of funding setup. We'll call this contract as a website implementation. And we'll say, yeah, it is being funded by this customer Active Transport. And we are implementing a website for them. The sales currency has defaulted. Let's create this contract. And if you notice on the funding sources fast tab, you see that the customer with which you created the contract has defaulted as the funding source for that contract. And there are no funding limits set up, so there is yet, so there is no not to exceed. And there is one funding rule that is created. A funding rule determines who a transaction will get billed to. Here, since we have only one funding source, which is our customer funding source, we're saying that 100% of any single transaction amount is billed to that customer. Now, in a scenario where you may have multiple customers funding a certain engagement, you would first add the customer as a funding source. So let's add a customer as a second funding source on this. So Active Transport and Brakes and Gears are both going to fund this project. Now, as you notice here, funding type can be customer or it can be an internal organization or a grant. In the case of public sector, we see that the grant functionality is used where you may have a big infrastructure project that is partly funded by grant and partly funded by the government. So that is the scenario in which a grant could be a funding source. In this example, let's take the customer funded, privately funded project. So there are 2 customers that are funding for this website, and we have them set up here. But whenever you add a funding source, you will have to fix the funding rules that are here, because the default funding source, the first one that gets created, will create a default funding rule which allocates all billable amounts to one customer or the first customer with which you created the contract. So let's create a funding split. So let's choose our new customer and then let's distribute, say that both of these customers are going to distribute the costs of this engagement equally, and Active Transport will take any rounding. So now we have set up a funding rule and we have set up 2 customers that are going to fund this project. Funding rules have a prioritized order in that the first, you can have multiple funding rules and there can only be one rule with priority 1. So that rule will be the one that is applied. Only in a scenario where that rule cannot be used will the system default to the funding rule of a lower priority. When deciding how to split the amount of the transaction recorded, AX uses the split percentage that you defined in the allocation of the funding rule. If the split amount, after splitting, if the amount violates the funding limit, then it goes to the rule of a lower priority. So let's add another rule. Let's say that the Pri1 rule says that active transport and brakes and gears are going to split the costs evenly. And let's say there is a funding limit where active transport wants to limit its exposure to maybe $500 on this contract. So the moment transactions exceed, again, the split amount that is allocated to active transport exceeds this 500, then the system will not allow any further transaction posting. In that case, we'll have to create a funding rule of a lower priority where everything will go to brakes and gears after that. So according to the way this funding has been set up to the first, up to the point where active transport's funding limit is not consumed, both customers will split the costs evenly. But once active transport has spent its money, all of its available budget for this project, which is $500, everything will then be paid by brakes and gears. That is the setup we have here. So let's see this setup in action. Let's go ahead and log a few transactions against this contract, for which we'll first have to create a project. We'll call this website implementation, as we did for the contract name. Let's give it a project group, and we'll assign. It's not required to put in a customer. If you have a single funded project contract, any project under that contract umbrella will default with the customer ID of that contract. If you have a contract that has multiple funding sources, then the customer ID is not defaulted. It'll ask you to pick, but it's not required to pick. So let's go ahead and log a few our transactions, and let's see what happens when we post the transactions. So we'll set the project in process state. This is required based on the stage rules in Dynamics AX. Setting the project in process is required for logging any transactions on the project. So let's create an hour transaction on this project. We'll say this is of management consulting hours. Log 10 hours on this. And with the sales price of $300, it's going to be $3,000 that is going to get posted to this project or the contract. However, we know that active transport can only fund up to 500. So let's see what happens when we post this transaction. So the transaction has been posted. Let's navigate to the contract. You can see that on the funding limit that we have set up for active transport for $500, the spent amount is 500. So active transport has used up all of their funding. Therefore, the rest of it must have gone to brakes and gears. So let's look at the transaction to figure that out. Let's go to the Maintain tab, Posted Transactions. On this transaction, let's view the transaction. And on the Sales tab of the transaction window, you will be able to see how the system split up the transaction. So it has applied the first funding rule and split up the amount on the transaction equally as 500, and then the rest of the amount, which is $2,000, it gave it exclusively to brakes and gears. So you can see that the system has split it up between active transport and brakes and gears in the way we have set up our funding limits and funding rules on the project contract. Now, at this point, we come to we have another option or another constraint that we can set up on this contract at this time. We can say that even brakes and gears wants to limit their exposure on this particular project to about, say, $5,000, right? So we'll add a funding limit for brakes and gears as well. Say brakes and gears has a funding limit of about $5,000. Now, since I'm adding this after the fact of some transactions being logged, you won't see any spent amount. But if I now go and log a transaction that is beyond $5,000, it cannot allocate any portion of that transaction to active transport, since active transport has already used up its limit. So it will apply the funding rule that is next in priority, and then that rule says that everything should go to brakes and gears, but brakes and gears has a limit of 5,000. So let's go navigate to the project and log a transaction that is beyond $5,000. Let's create a new timesheet line or an hour journal line. And let's say this is going to be consulting hours for 50 hours. So at the rate of $300, we'll try to post this transaction. It's well over $5,000. So let's post this transaction. And at this point, we get an error saying revenue cannot be allocated because funding rules do not allow for this revenue to be allocated. So at this stage, since our funding limits have been set up in such a way that we can no longer post any transaction beyond $5,000 on this project. At this stage, no more transaction posting is no transaction that is over 5,000 can be posted on this project contract. Now, while it is likely that you may want to go ahead with posting transactions while you negotiate some extra funding with your customers, because work on the project can proceed while you're negotiating some extra funding. So in this case, we come to the concept of having an on-hold funding source. So while you're negotiating with brakes or active transport for more funding, you can, in order to let the consultants continue to post their transactions, what you should do is you can set up, you can create an on-hold funding source. Let's navigate to the funding sources fast tab and add an on-hold funding source, map it to an internal organization. Let's say we map it to our own internal IT consulting practice, and then we try to go back and post the transaction that we have. Let's open up that transaction. That we were trying to post. So we'll open this and we'll try, this one is the posted transaction. This is our unposted transaction. So now we'll try to post this transaction, and now we are able to post this transaction because we have an on-hold funding source, and that works like a catch-all funding source when in the event that you have any not to exceed limits that are enforced, you can set up an on-hold funding source while you renegotiate those limits with your customers. So now if we go back to our contract and look at the fast tab, the fact box that is at the very end on the contract details page, we will see that there is an amount of $10,000 that is gone to the on-hold funding source, which is our own internal IT consulting practice. So the transaction is there with this funding source stamped on it until the point where you have more funding, and then you can go ahead and update the funding on active transport in the funding limits, or whichever is the customer that you have this transaction, and then you can go back and try to process an adjustment which will then move this transaction from this on-hold funding source into one of these customer invoiceable or customer chargeable transactions so that those can be invoiced to the customer. So let's review some of the concepts that we discussed in funding setup. So a funding source is a party that is responsible for paying for your engagement. Now, funding source on a project contract can be a customer, grant, or an internal organization. If it's a customer, it's an externally funded project, and if it's a grant, it is also externally funded, but you're using the grant money, which requires the same invoicing process, but it's just that the money is coming from a grant and not from a customer. And then if it's an internal organization, it is an on-hold funding source, and then you can later redistribute the money sitting in the on-hold funding source to any of the external chargeable funding sources. A funding limit, it's a not to exceed limit, and it can be set up for a funding source, and it is usually set up for time and material contracts, and a funding limit is validated at the time of transaction posting and not at the time of invoice creation. Funding rules. Each funding rule defines the split of billing or how the transaction amount will be divided between customers that are going to pay for this transaction. And the split percentage can be defined on the funding rule, and funding rules are prioritized in that the first funding rule, the funding rule with priority 1 is applied first, and if it results in a violation of a funding limit, that's when the system rolls over to a funding rule that is of a lower priority. On-hold funding source. This is used as a temporary holding space for transactions that have caused to exceed the funding limit. And after renegotiation of funding with your customer, you can take the transactions that have been posted to the on-hold and move them to any one of the customers that have some funding available for your project. And on-hold funding sources in AX map to internal organizations.